Hi everybody, Gary here. We're going to get right into this episode of Lost Treasure Stories, but I have a quick announcement to make first. I'm no longer including a Lost Treasure Found story in these episodes. The exciting news is I'm creating a new separate playlist of Lost Treasure Found stories. Okay, please hold the applause down for just a second. Starting now, we'll alternate videos. One video will be Lost Treasure Stories, and the next will be a Lost Treasure Found video. So after this episode, we'll have our very first Lost Treasure Found video. Then, of course, after that, we'll have another regular Lost Treasure episode, and so on. Our Lost Treasure Found videos will include the same absolutely insane stories of Lost Treasure Found, just like the ones included in our previous videos. Okay, I better shut up and get this show on the road. Enjoy, everybody.
All throughout the 19th century and the early to mid-20th century, it was known that farmers, ranchers, outlaws, and many shady characters buried or hid their hoards of cash and coins for safekeeping. In many cases, even the farmers and ranchers didn't tell even their family members where it was buried or hidden. They usually intended to tell a family member where it was before they died, but sometimes they died a sudden death, so their secret became another lost treasure story. Our videos feature little-known lost treasure hoards in every state that are still waiting to be found and have a very good chance of recovery. Our lost treasure stories are from the private files of our historical researcher, who has spent over 45 years researching these types of stories, so most of them have never appeared in any online treasure hunting websites or books, so they have been unheard of for 50 to 150 years or more. We also include one lost treasure found story at the end of each video, such as the $500,000 in cash that was found under an old feed mill in 1963 after the mill owner died, or the $195,000 gold coin hoard from the 1840s that a poor farmer found as he was digging out his septic tank in 1982. This lost treasure story is from a newspaper article dated September 27, 1922. The headline of the article is, "Wouldn't Tell," and the article reads, "Application of a candle blaze on the feet of Lou Beard, a farmer residing a mile north of Copan, Oklahoma, until he screamed with pain, was one of the methods used by 3 robbers to make Beard tell where he had held his gold, after the bandits had entered his home early Wednesday morning and obtained only $28 which he had on his person. 2 men giving the names of Theodore Decker and Harry Powell were arrested in Copan this morning, and the local authorities are looking for the 3rd man. Beard is alleged to be a miser, and it has been the rumor for many years that he had a secret cache of gold hidden on his farm, authorities say. Beard and John Harper, an aged helper around the place, were badly beaten by the 3 men. After denying that he had any gold hidden about the place, Beard was taken down in the cellar, and here the men applied a candle flame to his bare feet, he told authorities. He repeatedly denied having any gold hidden away, so the men took him upstairs and beat him severely. This lost treasure story is from a newspaper article dated April 13, 1917. The article title is "Clue to Buried Gold." This is a will of my own construction, and as a man of good health and sound mind, I, W.F. Bryan, black man, give and bequest to the finder of this will half of a gallon glass jug full of gold coins, which lies buried 5 feet deep and 30 feet east of the section corner of my old homestead. The finder must publish this story before any work begins on its recovery, but the finder must get another party to dig for it, and the digger gets half. I did this to keep my lazy kinfolk from getting it. If they make any fuss about it after it is found, give them $1 each. There is also another jugful buried a few rods west of the old dwelling house. I can't locate it, however, as the mark is lost. Dated and signed the 2nd day of October, 1888, W.F. Bryan. A side note on this article is Bryan, who is well remembered by the old residents of Centrailia, died in the early 90s. Allen Miller, a present resident of Centrailia, was a nephew of Mrs. Bryan, who died about 6 weeks ago. There is also an article from January 27, 1917, which is a date that precedes the previous article. It tells of a search for the gold on the Bryan property, but nothing was reported found after that. Here's that article titled, "Was He a Joker?" Gold hunters prospected around the old home of W.F. Bryan today, following the discovery of his will, dated 1888. The will said 2 jugs of gold had been buried on the property, and that it was a case of finders keepers. This was done, said the will, to keep Bryan's lazy kinfolk from getting the money. This is a short little mention in a Coeur d'Alene, Idaho newspaper dated October 3, 1903. The story is, a number of people have been searching for Chief Saltese's lost treasure. It is said that years ago the chief put several $1,000s in gold into an old kettle and buried it near an immense cedar stump on a small creek across the river from here. He then went on a visit to the lower country and never returned to the old camp, but told friends about the cache. Up to date, no one has reported its discovery. This lost treasure story is from a local historical book from Obion County, Tennessee. The story as it appeared follows. A treasure story still being told around Troy, Tennessee, in Obion County, is that of Archie Crockett. Crockett owned a cotton gin in Troy that made him a fortune. His house was located near where the Troy Community Center is today. Crockett had a fanatical fear of banks and would accept nothing in payment except gold or silver coins. His wife saw him many times slip out of the house after dark with a jar full of coins. He would be gone about 10 minutes each time. When he returned, he would be empty-handed. She asked him to tell her the location of the money, but he always refused. Crockett had a love for horses and enjoyed riding at full speed in his nearby pasture. On August 2, 1901, he was riding at full gallop when his horse fell and Crockett was seriously injured. He was taken home where it was discovered that he could neither move or talk. His wife pleaded with him to tell the location of the family fortune. Crockett would move his eyes toward the horse pasture, which was some 350 feet west of the house. Finally, Crockett died and took his secret with him. This lost treasure story is from a newspaper article from December 24, 1883. The title is, An Eccentric Farmer. A few days ago, a very wealthy farmer named Harris Damond, who was so eccentric that he hid every cent of his money as soon as he obtained it, was taken suddenly sick of apoplexy. Before he could tell anyone where the money was hidden, he died. After his burial, search was made for it under his beehives, and under each one was found concealed a large amount of paper money, the whole sum being $14,000. Further search was made by a son in the barn and discovered a vessel filled with gold coin amounting to $74,000. $10,000 is still to be accounted for. As a side note to this story, this $10,000 has never been known to be found. The Lost Treasure of Dr. Docker is a newspaper article of February 15, 1922. The article title is, Search for Pot of Gold on Commerce, Missouri Farm. Before we get into the story, I've seen a story published in an old Lost Treasure magazine relating to this story, but that article said the doctor's last name was Decker. There is also another newspaper article that states the doctor's name as Decker. I believe the correct spelling to be Decker, but more research is needed. Here's the story. For the third time in 50 years, residents of this vicinity are engaged in a search for treasure. 2 previous failures in the venture have not dampened interest, which is running high. The search is for a pot of gold said to contain thousands of dollars that was buried by a Dr. Docker during the Civil War on his farm near Commerce. The report has been that the doctor, fearing that his home would be ransacked by both the Confederate and Union armies, buried his fortune and confided the secret of the hiding place in only one person, an aged black woman who worked on his farm. Dr. Docker died shortly after burying the gold, according to the story, leaving the black woman alone with the secret. A number of men demanded that the black woman reveal the hiding place after the doctor's death. Their demand was refused and they beat her severely. She died as a result of the beating, and the last records of the secret hiding place were carried to the grave with her. Marshall Moore and A.E. Pinkerton of this community said they were told where to dig to find the treasure by a medium living nearby. The two men are using a magnetic needle in the search. Old residents say that an unsuccessful search was made by 5 men after the death of the black woman, and then a short time later another fertile hunt was made by a party led by a newspaper man named Hoffman of Cape Girardeau. Numerous holes, where it is believed the gold was buried, were dug by the parties. And here's another quick mention in a different newspaper where the name of the doctor is spelled D-E-C-K-E-R. This article was from February the 2nd, 1922, and it goes on to say, Marshall Moore and A.E. Pinkerton are engaged in a search for a treasure of gold buried before the Civil War on the estate of a Dr. Decker, by him. The search is the third of its kind in the past half-century or so, and none of the searchers have turned up any gold. This lost treasure story is from a newspaper article of July 21, 1902. The title is, Treasure Mystery at Moultrie. The headline misspelled the town name of Moultrie. The headline spelled it M-O-U-L-T-R-Y, but the correct spelling is M-O-U-T-R-I-E. It doesn't affect the story, but it is an interesting tidbit, and it shows newspapers could get the facts wrong back in the day, just like news stories still do today sometimes. The story goes, the death of the late Mrs. Futch, an aged lady of Moultrie, whose funeral occurred in this city yesterday, recalls the real story of buried gold which now lies undiscovered, probably upon the old farm on which she spent many years of her life, and in quest of which she devoted many hours. Her husband, the late Joshua Futch, was a man of secretive habits, one who told little about his own affairs, and who did not even divulge to his own family his financial condition. He was a thrifty cattleman, and, like many woodmen, he had a horror of modern methods of banking. A number of years ago, Mr. Futch sold to Mr. William Sanchez a bunch of cattle, for which he received $1,300 in gold. Mr. Sanchez and his father enjoyed the confidence of nearly all the country people of St. Johns County with whom they had dealings. In a burst of confidence, Mr. Futch told Mr. Sanchez that the gold he received from him at the time he had buried, and that no living person knew of its hiding place. He also stated that whenever he received money that he did not need in his business, he converted it into gold and made another deposit in Mother Earth. He was tempted to reveal to Mr. Sanchez its hiding place, but the latter gentleman begged him not to tell him. For if, by any possibility, some person should track him to his hiding place and make away with the money, he would perhaps always suspect Mr. Sanchez as the only person who knew the secret. Mr. Futch was urged to inform his wife of the secret. This he declined to do, but promised Mr. Sanchez that if at any time he became ill or anything serious happened, he would send for him and tell where his money was hidden. About 4 years ago, Mr. Sanchez received a hurried summons to go out to the Futch place, which is about 7 miles from town. He mounted a horse and galloped up to the place. Mr. Futch laid there speechless and almost unconscious, and the secret died on his lips. Mr. Sanchez told the story to Mrs. Futch, who has since been unceasing until her death to discover the treasure. The news gradually got abroad, and one day Mrs. Futch was visited by an aged white man who assured her that he could, with a divining rod, discover the money. A party of young men accompanied him, one of them being Cornelius DuPont, who still lives in the neighborhood. The trip was made in accordance with the approved tradition in the dead of night. After tramping over the country for nearly 2 hours, the divining rod bent suddenly toward the ground. Amid great excitement, the old man pushed the steel rod into the earth. At a depth of a few feet, a hard substance was struck. DuPont, to make sure, took an axe and drove the rod firmly into the obstruction. After vigorous digging, they found the rod had been forced through a live oak root. The whereabouts of Mr. Futch's gold is still a mystery, and as the couple died childless, the chances of it being recovered are, to say the least, problematic. This lost treasure story is from the Gordon Family History website titled, The Fighting Gordons of Greenland by Ralph Gordon. There is a link to the family website where more details about this story can be found in the description box. Jim Gordon, along with other family members, had a very large and successful cotton farm when the Civil War started in. Jim was also famous in all the land for the prized horses that he bred and raised on the farm. The Gordon family was struggling to get the cotton picked in the fall of 1862 to market because of Union blockades in the area at that time. The Gordon brothers' work would yield them nothing that year. In need of cash, Jim sold most of his horses to the Confederate Army, keeping only a few of his best mares and stallions for future herd development. He also sold most of the cattle and hogs that belonged to him and Eli, insisting on gold for payment, as he did not trust any other form of payment. He planned well, having fewer animals to winter. What he did not plan for was a Yankee by the name Benjamin Grierson of the Illinois Cavalry. On April 17 of 1863, Colonel Grierson launched a raid from LaGrange, Tennessee that carried over 1,000 Yankee soldiers through Pontotoc, Union, Hazelhurst, and on into Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he connected with other Federal forces and laid siege to Vicksburg. Confederate forces were spread very thin in central Mississippi, giving Grierson an almost free will to raid and burn. In Newton, Grierson burned the depot, the Confederate Army Hospital, and destroyed 2 Confederate troop trains. Yankee horses were bred as draft animals, but in the South mules were used in the fields as horses were bred for the saddle and racing. The reputation of Jim Gordon's horses was no secret anywhere in Mississippi, and Grierson's scouts were very proficient at obtaining information. It did not take them long to learn about Jim Gordon's prized horses. Upon arriving in Union, Grierson sent most of his troops ahead while he remained to loot and forage the local civilians. Grierson's army raided corn cribs and barns, and more. From some he took food and grain, from others he took personal belongings. From Jim Gordon he took what every Yankee cavalry officer who ever crossed the Mason-Dixon line dreamed of, Jim Gordon's horses. Jim knew there would be more Yankee raids coming, but had no idea how merciless the next band of Yankees would prove to be. In the spring of 1863, with little livestock left and facing the uncertainty the war had created, Jim went to Meridian on business and would return in a few days. Jim loaded the gold he had received from the sale of his horses onto a wagon, then made the 30-mile trip to deposit the gold in a Meridian bank. The banker, obviously eager to do business with his old friend and fellow horse trader, offered Jim a considerable amount of Confederate money for his bounty, an offer Jim quickly rejected. Jim was willing to accept Yankee dollars and nothing else, but as when he sold his horses there were no Yankee dollars to be had in Meridian, Mississippi. Jim returned to his farm where he buried the gold, and the location of the buried gold is still a mystery today. This is a lost treasure story from a newspaper article, October 14, 1932. But before we get into the article, be aware that later in the story it states, quote, Mr. Green decided to move to Kansas. The truth is, Mr. Green didn't decide to move to Kansas. He moved to Kansas because he didn't have a choice. He moved to Kansas because in a controversial attempt to quell guerrilla warfare along the Missouri-Kansas border, Union General Thomas Ewing issued General Order No. 11, exiling several thousand people from their homes in western Missouri. The August 25, 1863 orders required that all persons living in Jackson, Cass, Bates, and northern Vernon counties remove from their present places of residence. That makes more sense why a man would hurriedly bury his gold, then, leaving his gold behind, get out of Dodge. So on with the story. When John Green died 65 years ago, he never had heard of a ground radio, an instrument that lets out a screech when it is carried over land in which there is metal. But one of these ground radios is now being used in an effort to find the thousands of dollars which John Green buried on his Bates County farm when he left this country to escape Price's raiders during the Civil War. Some $30,000 in gold coins and $3,000 in currency is supposed to be buried on his old farm. Dozens of people have searched the farm, and now the ground radio is being used. Green came to Missouri when a boy, after running away from his Massachusetts home because he didn't want to attend school. Life on the frontier was hard. 3 of his children burned to death while he and his wife were working in the woods. Food in the early days was scarce. Before Green's death, he was harassed by the pro-slave raiders and Kansas bushwhackers. While he never had personal trouble with either group, He was known as a Free State sympathizer and finally decided it was wise to move to Kansas. In spite of troubles, John Green prospered. Before he fled, he buried numerous caches of gold and silver. He told no one where the money was hidden, fearing his wife or 3 daughters might be tortured by robbers if they knew the location. Shortly after he moved to Kansas, Green contracted smallpox and died. On his deathbed, he started to tell his wife where his money was hidden. Some of it was buried under a stump, some under a pile of shingles by the old sawmill, a sack full near the foundation of the house, and more in a wagon hub near the shed. Another catch in a kettle at the foot of a tree. But he died before he told where the big catch was buried. Thousands of dollars was unearthed when the family moved back after the war. But the bulk of the fortune never had been found. The search was renewed by the owners of a ground radio, working in agreement with surviving relatives. In a closing note not included in the article, nothing more was found using the modern instrument. In fact, no more of the treasure that was known to be buried by John Green has ever been known to be found. This lost treasure story is an excerpt from a regular newspaper column titled Tolbert's News, written by Frank X. Tolbert. The column appeared in the Dallas Morning News from 1946 until his death in 1984. And on to the story. South of Rural Shade and in the vicinity of the ruined old Ingram family graveyard, I took a hike to get the kinks out of my legs. For I'd been driving a motor car for several hours. And near the graveyard I met some young men from Houston. They were operating 2 metal detectors. The youths were interested in finding only one breed of flowers, wild roses, and the wild roses must be a pinkish hue. Apparently they hadn't gotten any encouraging responses from the metal detectors. Nor had they found any pink wild roses. It happens I'm familiar with the stories of Bill Perryman, Emmeline Atkins, and other historians that several pots of gold coins were buried in ground marked by stands of wild roses in a field close to Rural Shade. Hugh and Washington Ingram, brothers and wealthy planners of long ago, were distrustful of banks, or maybe bankers would be more precise. And they were supposed to have buried several steel containers of double eagles or $20 gold pieces on the old Ingram plantation. According to one yarn, told me at the Rural Shade store before it closed about 10 years ago, Hugh died first and Brother Wash was fixing to tell his family where the gold was stowed away in the ground. Only Wash Ingram up and died at 90 before he could recite the locations of the double eagles trove. Most every treasure tale has the same plot. Still, there has to be some truth to the story of the buried Ingram gold, for in 1947 a box of gold coins was plowed up in a cultivated field on the A.L. Bain Ranch near Rural Shade. And this was acreage that had once belonged to the Ingram family. This is how it happened. In 1947, one of A.L. Bain's ranch hands, a giant black man named Fred Rhymes, nicknamed Hoss, was operating a hand plow. Hoss Rhymes and his mule-drawn hand plow were being followed by 5 other workers. The 5 were sowing Bermuda grass seed in furrows made by the 8-inch plow. There were 90 of them, double eagles. The coins had a face value of about $2,000. Hoss Rhymes and the other black men were honorable men. The 6 hands put the gold coins in fruit jars. Then they went to the Bain Ranch headquarters and reported what they found. A.L. Bain also behaved admirably. He took only a 7th share of the coins. Unlike his employees, Mr. Bain was aware that the gold coins were worth much more than face value to coin collectors. Some of the double eagles were dated in the 1830s. And, protected by the steel box, the coins were in mint condition. The coins were sold to collectors for about $5,000, or so I was told at the Round Prairie store several years ago. That store is now closed. It's too bad that the honest rancher and his 6 honest employees couldn't have waited until 1975 to market their double eagles. On today's gold market, those coins found in the furrows would be worth at least $20,000. Perhaps much more because of their antiquity and mint condition. When he ran the store in Rural Shade, Waylon Phillips told me that the Ingram brothers were said to have buried 3 clutches of gold coins. The Ingram family found one of the steel boxes of gold about 5 feet deep in the earth, marked by a clump of pink wild roses. They never found the other 2 boxes of gold. Since the Ingram family found one box, and Hoss Ryan's plow found another one, there must still be one pot of gold deep in the dark earth under some rainbow, arched over the flowering pink roses of the Rural Shade countryside. Rural Shade is said to have a headless ghost in residence. Unlike most headless ghosts, this one is a pedestrian. But then Rural Shade was always a one-horse town, and never could spare a horse for its headless ghost. This story is courtesy of a book from the Delaware County, New York Genealogy and History site. The title of the Delaware book is The History of Delaware County. The author of the story that appears in the Delaware County book is W. W. Munsell, who lived between 1797 and 1880. The title of his book was The Town of Kortright. A link to the Delaware County book is in the description for this episode. This story is just a short excerpt from that book. The story reads, several Scotchmen settled within the present limits of the town of Kortright before the Revolutionary War, some at the head of Betty's Brook, some at a point on the Delaware River below where Mr. James Sackrider now lives, known as the Hog's Back, and others on Wright's Brook. Of the latter, the following story is told. Among them was one who for those times was considered wealthy, if indeed gold could have constituted wealth in so isolated a spot. After the war broke out, the murderers and lawless depredations committed upon the lives and property of the frontier settlers gave this man a timely warning. He saw safety only in flight. Although favorably inclined to the British government, a heavy bounty had been offered for scalps, and the Indians were as likely to sacrifice friend as foe. The family prepared to leave. The arrangements were completed, their goods boxed and buried or otherwise secreted in a place of recognition by themselves through the agency of marked trees, the owners intending to return and possess themselves of their property as soon as peace should be restored. The Scotsman, afraid to take much money with him in his flight, pondered long and earnestly on what manner most effectually to conceal his pile. At last he bethought himself to bury it. Selecting a spot favorable to his purpose, he sank an excavation at the roots of a hollow tree, in which he deposited the wallet containing, as he asserted upon his dying bed, 500 guineas, and carefully replaced the dirt, and designated the spot by a marked line of trees to the junction of Wright's Brook with the Delaware River. He sought refuge in Canada, and while there his family became the victims of a contagious disease. One by one they were consigned to the grave, until he alone remained. At last he was taken ill himself, and when on his dying bed, he called the physician who had attended him during his illness, and revealed to him the secret of his hidden treasures and all the intended circumstances. Immediately after the declaration of peace, the physician, not doubting from the statement of the dying man that he could easily discover the concealed treasure, made a journey into the county in search of it. He arrived at the place now known as Boonville, concealing the object of his mission from everyone, and accounting for his strange conduct by pretending to be searching for herbs of rare medicinal properties which a friendly Indian had told him abounded in that region. He readily discovered the line of marked trees, but alas, he had come too late. The improvements of the Scotsman were now occupied by an enterprising settler, and upon the identical spot where the treasure was concealed years before was now a waving heavy crop of wheat. The physician made careful inquiries of the occupant, who stated that in plowing the field the plowshare had struck and smashed the end of a wooden box, which upon examination he found to have once contained clothing, but which only a few decayed remnants remained. He had also plowed up a set of harrow teeth and an iron wedge, and those were all that he had discovered. After a proper search of nearly a week, the physician was compelled to abandon his quest and return to meet other engagements.